Thank you, David. And thanks to you and Melissa and the Center for Ancient Studies for inviting me here to discuss inequality. I think the topic is still timely. As I remind my editor when I ask for extensions periodically, I don't think it will cease to be relevant whenever I do complete the book. I thought maybe I'd spend a few minutes, very briefly, give an overview of the book I'm writing, and then move on to talk about Plato this morning. So my book project is, as David suggested, about economic inequality in the history of political thought, and it has three aims, some of which will already be well known by members of this audience. The first aim certainly is, and that's to remind readers that economic inequality is not a new problem. It's been with us forever. The second aim is to indicate to readers that political philosophy has been engaged with the question of economic inequality pretty much from the beginning, from Plato. Folks have been writing about and thinking about and problematizing economic inequality. And the third ambition of the book is an intervention in some contemporary political debates about economic inequality. And that's a suggestion that we can separate off inequality from the question of poverty, as if that were possible, and it is possible to a degree, but we, even if we were to solve the problem of poverty, as some folks are arguing these days, that wouldn't save us from the problems of inequality, at least if we're to believe a number of canonical figures from the Western tradition. So I begin my book, and I'll be talking today about Plato. And a quick overview. I'll provide a little bit of an introduction, a little bit of historical background. Again, I think much of the historical background will be familiar to folks here from ancient studies. And then I'll hone in on Plato and talk very briefly about his Republic, which most people know, but then really focus on his laws, which people don't know as well, typically. Within the laws, I'll be talking about why Plato's characters in the laws think inequality is a problem, and what they think might be done to ameliorate it. Okay, so brief introduction, and I'm going to read just a little bit, and then I'll be doing more summarizing of my arguments. So it's often been remarked that Plato ranks among the greatest proponents of elitism in Western civilization. This reputation is largely associated with his celebrated Republic, in which his Socrates elevates to political power, quote, those few people who are born with the best natures and who receive the best education. By virtue of their rare talents and training, the philosopher rulers come to assume a godlike authority over their less gifted fellows in the names of justice and goodness. It is for this reason that many critics, such as Karl Popper, have railed against Plato for his hostility toward the egalitarian creed. R.H.S. Crossman went so far as to characterize Plato's Colloquium as, quote, but another variant of oligarchy. To be sure, the Republic depicts in its account of the city and speech a kind of inegalitarian society, whereby political power is to be exercised by a small elite. But this account fails to acknowledge another profoundly egalitarian dimension of Plato's thought. Despite the epistemic and political inequality underlying political institutions and what Socrates refers to as Glaucon's Collopolis, or beautiful city, his major political works reveal a pervasive and even foundational economic egalitarianism outlined in his utopian republic and in the later and more practical laws. It's in the latter that he outlines in greatest detail the dangers of inequality and the foundational necessity of resolving the problem before commencing with legislation. My essay here traces the concern with the problem of inequality in these dialogues by understanding the danger of inequality in the ancient Greek world before then turning to a problematization of it in his major political dialogues. As I'll argue, Plato's concern with economic equality is fundamental and systemic to the point of characterizing inequality as the greatest of all plagues in the laws, insofar as it fosters the civic divisions that are ultimately fatal to all republics. While there are important differences in his treatment of economic inequality in the Republic and the Laws, they're united on central themes. Both dialogues suggest that economic inequality undermines the virtue and civic harmony required for thriving republics. The greater this inequality, the less stable the regime. Plato's attention to inequality is hence fundamental, which makes it striking that scholars haven't made it as much of a focus of it for extended examination in the past. All right, so a little bit of background, and I'm going to do this quickly again because I think there are so many classicists here who know this history, in fact, far better than I do. But it's instructive, I think, to go back and consider how economic inequality was part of certainly the history and formed part of the intellectual background for people in Plato's Athens. We find accounts from Plutarch of Solon and Lycurgus and their interventions, their constitutional interventions in Athens and Sparta, respectively. And as you read these accounts, there's clearly an emphasis on the problem of inequality and, in fact, how that inequality necessitated the interventions of Solon and Lycurgus. Plutarch describes a disparity of fortune between rich and poor in Athens as having reached its height. All the people were indebted to the rich, they had engaged their bodies for debt, were sent into slavery at home or sold to strangers, forced to sell their children or flee their country to escape the cruelty of their creditors. And Plutarch goes on to describe Solon's intervention in Athens in response to this. And Solon is essentially a moderate figure. He doesn't give the poor everything they want, nor does he give the rich everything they want. He remits debts but doesn't redistribute property, and seems to achieve a kind of stability in the Athenian regime thereafter. Lycurgus, by contrast, is more of a radical. Again, this is Plutarch's account. He writes of Lycurgus's Sparta, quote, "There was an extreme inequality amongst the Spartans, and their state was overloaded with a multitude of indigent and necessitous persons, while its whole wealth was centered upon a very few." Lycurgus's interventions, as I suggested, are more radical. Among other things, he does redistribute property. He eliminates currency, as he sees currency as a major contributing factor to inequality. He expels luxury and institutes common meals, which he sees as a way of curbing the excesses of the extremely rich. These reforms were not as well received initially. Plutarch recounts a story of one of the oligarchs stabbing Lycurgus in the eye upon hearing about these reforms. Although, amazingly, somehow they become friends after that. Maybe there's a lesson in that, or not. At any rate, all this is part of the historical imagination of the ancient Greeks. We should also note, and I mentioned this in passing, but a great deal could be said about this indeed. In Plato's own youth, and Plato was born during the Peloponnesian War, Athens itself had a series of revolutions, alternately oligarchic and democratic. And one certainly gets a sense, given the Greek history and indeed the living history of Plato's own youth, that inequality was a serious matter of concern. All right. But let me turn now much more specifically to Plato. And I'm just going to mention briefly here his Republic, saving the bulk of my remarks again for the Laws. Plato's Republic, I think the first thing we need to think about when thinking about inequality is Plato's stress, of course, through the character of Socrates, on matters of civic harmony and fraternity. And you find this in all kinds of passages. For example, even the Noble Lie, the first half of the Noble Lie is an account of how we get citizens to imagine themselves as all having the same mother, right? They all descend from Mother Earth. And there's plenty of images throughout the Republic where Plato's Socrates stresses the centrality of building these fraternal bonds among citizens. And it's in that context, I think, that we can appreciate Plato's scatter remarks on economic inequality in the Republic, where he describes a situation of there being two cities oftentimes in states, a city of the rich and a city of the poor, which one finds not only in oligarchic regimes, but other states with oligarchic elements. And this fundamentally undermines, to his mind, the centrality of building what he calls a community of pleasures and pains. In some way, maybe the most important metaphor in the Republic is when Socrates encourages his interlocutors to think of the Republic as a biological organism, right? If you step on a rusty nail, you can't dismiss it as your foot's problem. It's a problem for your whole body. And he encourages his interlocutors to think the same about the state, about the Republic. That if individual citizens, or certainly classes of citizens, are insulted or struggling, that's not simply the problem of the poor. That's a problem for everyone. So I'm not going to say much or anything right now about how Plato plans on addressing these issues in the Republic, because I think the Laws are ultimately much richer on this dimension. So now I'm going to skip up to the Laws. And Plato's Laws begins with a very familiar theme, that is, again, of civic harmony and friendship. When you open up the Laws and begin reading, the very first question the interlocutors are engaging is the question of, well, what's the purpose of the Laws? And the Cretan Clinius says, oh, well, to fight wars and, build successful armies. And the main interlocutor in the Laws is not Socrates here, incidentally. It's the Athenian stranger. And the Athenian stranger dismisses that quickly. It's not about fighting and winning wars, although there might be a place for that down the road. But rather, the purpose of the Laws, he announces very early on, is reconciling citizens by laying down laws for them for the rest of time and securing their friendship for one another. Such a judge and lawgiver would be better by far. The purpose of the Laws, as he understands them, is to, quote, bring harmony to the city, to promote friendship and reconciliation. As he summarizes, the best is neither war nor civil war, but rather peace and at the same time, goodwill toward one another. And this is an overriding, persistent theme throughout the laws. And it's with this background, I think, that we have to think about Plato's exploration of the problem of economic inequality. And in my remaining time here, I want to talk about how in the laws he describes inequality to be a problem, and then his answers on to the how we might solve or at least address the problem of inequality. Okay, so let's talk about why inequality is a problem. And I'm going to turn to Book 3 of Plato's Laws, where he gives arguably perhaps the first account of what early modern specialists call the state of nature, a kind of origin story of government and laws. And in telling this story about where government and laws might come from, he begins by describing a great flood, wiping out the vast majority of civilization, leaving only scattered shepherds up on the mountaintops who were able to take sanctuary from their altitude. And much like the plagues that were described, that Walter Scheidel described last night, this flood has remarkably salutary effects. The shepherds emerge after the waters recede, Plato says, delighted with one another and full of goodwill. And that's interesting enough, but they're delighted and full of goodwill, specifically, as the Athenian stranger describes it, because there is neither wealth nor poverty after everybody's possessions have been wiped out. And in the absence of wealth and poverty, the stranger celebrates, there is, quote, neither insolence nor injustice, nor again jealousies and ill will. That's the first encounter with inequality, significant encounter with inequality and wealth in the laws, but it comes up again with remarkable consistency after that. Sometime after this, Plato's stranger then discusses Persian history with an emphasis on the kings Cyrus and Darius. And he says these are basically the same stories. Cyrus and Darius, neither one of them were raised in royal families with expectations of wealth and power, but they achieved it. And as a consequence, Cyrus and Darius were relatively effective rulers who were, as the stranger describes it, able to bring about friendship and a sense of community. The problem is, on Plato's account, is that their sons didn't have the same upbringing and certainly not eventually the same temperaments as their fathers. He describes Cambyses specifically as a remarkably intemperate boy who's abandoned all sense of moderation, who, when he's told to share with his brother, simply decides to kill him. We get perhaps some predictable effects from all of this. A not terribly effective rule. We have princes who effectively run their states into the ground by an utter lack of all virtue. And in fact, as Plato describes the problem of the princes in Persia, he says at least 3 times, it is impossible to be raised with wealth and become virtuous at the same time. You can have one, but not the other. And he becomes a powerful critic of being raised with wealth and privilege. Wealth to the stranger makes virtue impossible. All right. So I want to turn now to how Plato thinks we might address the problem of economic inequality. And what's notable in Plato's discussion in the Laws about how we might address inequality is how he creates two entirely different strategies for dealing with inequality. His approach is very much context dependent. And these strategies are determined by whether or not one is legislating for a brand new colony, such as the Athenian stranger and his interlocutors are describing in the Laws, a society that has no previous inhabitants, no pre-existing property relationships, where one may feel free to go bold on matters of economic inequality. And then there's what everybody else does, which is the vast majority of legislation. How do you address inequality in situations where there already is property and a distribution of property, and most commonly an unequal distribution of property? What can we do under those circumstances? These are two very different questions in many ways. So I'll start with the ideal, which returns us to this situation after the flood, as the stranger describes. So let me just describe some of his measures he introduces here. The first, and I think the most striking measure, is that the stranger insists that there should be a strict 4-to-1 ratio of the wealthiest citizens to the poorest. And anybody who accumulates more than 4 times the wealth of the poorest citizen must then dedicate their surplus, as he says, back to the city and to the gods who possess the city. And he's rather emphatic on this point. He describes, in fact, one of the most important jobs of the government is to keep very careful records of how much money citizens have, so that that money can get redistributed as soon as those limits are reached. And in fact, any citizen who suspects another citizen of hoarding money or hiding money is entitled to bring lawsuits against those people. And if those lawsuits are borne out through the evidence, not only do the wealthy citizens lose all of their wealth, save for the lowest possible allotment, the one of that 4-to-1 ratio, but their name will also be permanently scarred by public shame, he says, for attempting to hide from the laws. So related to this also are inheritance taxes. Plato's Athenian stranger says there must be inheritance taxes, and he doesn't provide numbers, but I think we can work with the evidence we already have, which suggests that anybody inheriting money that would put them over that 4-to-1 ratio would then have to cede that money again back to the city and the city's gods. Another measure he takes is banishing all interest-bearing loans. He also banishes the buying and selling of landed property, which he sees as fueling inequality. He also, following Lycurgus, interestingly, wants to banish all gold and silver. And he also engages in a number of retail trade regulations. Interestingly, he's particularly interested in the problem of price gouging in the ancient world as well. That comes up quite a bit. So these are at least some of the measures that he engages in providing an ideal account of what we might do under ideal circumstances to solve the problem of inequality. But I want to turn now to his more moderate solution because somehow it feels more relevant. How do we engage the problem of inequality where property already exists and has been distributed unequally? What do we do about that? The immediate and short answer is we have to do something because the problem of inequality is very much a problem. Inequality, again, fosters all those problems of hubris on the part of the wealthy, desperation on the part of the poor. It fosters a sense that one lives in one of two cities rather than a whole city as part of a common endeavor. So we have to do something about it, but what do we do if we can't embrace the radical solution? His advice is to move slowly, as it were. And I'll read here a brief paragraph from the Laws that addresses this. The Athenian stranger says, "When a city with ancient roots is compelled to legislate about this," that's inequality, "it finds that it cannot leave things as they are, unchanged, nor is it able to change them in any way. The only thing left, so to speak, is prayer, and perhaps more relevantly, small and careful transformations that gradually produce a small result over a long period of time. For this to happen, there must be a continual supply of reformers from among those who possess an abundance of land and many debtors. These reformers must be willing, out of a sense of fairness, to share in some way what they have with any of their debtors who are in distress, forgiving some of their debts, parceling out some of their land. Thus they bring about a kind of measure and show that they believe poverty consists not in lessening one's property, but in an increase of one's avarice." So hence there's really two dimensions to his advice here. The first is to have essentially a committee composed of wealthy and poor citizens who look for opportunities to redistribute wealth and remit debts so as to bring about more equality. People who are, as he says, motivated by a sense of fairness. One might imagine, Warren Buffett types as they might have existed in the ancient world. But the other dimension of this is a reshaping of public morality, an increased shaming of avarice or greed or pleonexia, as the Greeks called it. As this stranger elaborates, a foundation of society in pleonexia is rotten and has to be overturned in order to increase a greater sense of fairness operating in a republic that might reduce overall inequality. So I think I'm going to stop here for reasons of time and provide an opportunity to discuss to answer questions.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, David. That was great.
Thank you, David and Melissa, for organizing this wonderful event, and thank you, Matthew Santaracco, for using the Center for Hellenic Studies to support this wonderful research and discussion about ancient and modern inequality. In the recent book, Taxing the Rich, Kenneth Shiva and David Stasavage evaluate arguments about fiscal fairness in Europe and the United States. Their focus is on democracies, but as they persuasively show, having more democracy, for example, by extending the franchise, does not by itself automatically lead to higher taxes on the rich. It depends very much on what counts as fairness. They consider three arguments that have been used to justify taxes on the rich over the past 2 centuries: equal treatment, everyone ought to do their fair share. Ability to pay, the rich can afford to pay higher taxes. And compensation, the rich must compensate the poor because state policies benefit the rich. In this paper, I offer a brief panorama of taxation in early Mediterranean societies, starting in the ancient Near East, then moving to Greece, and finally to the exportation, for lack of a better word, of Greek models of fiscal administration to other Mediterranean societies. Exportation is a misleading term, of course. Fiscal changes and innovations were due to experimentation and creative adaptation through peer polity interaction. I will argue, however, that the ability to tax the rich gave democratic city-states, in particular, competitive advantages that were emulated by oligarchical and monarchical regimes. Those regimes otherwise tended to foist the fiscal burden onto their poorer and politically weak subjects. It was not democracy per se, I argue, that led to taxes on the rich. On the contrary, we see all sorts of coercive taxation by autocrats in time of need. However, democracies found it easier to compensate the rich, persuading them about the fairness of higher taxes, and at the same time compel them to pay higher taxes. To put my argument simply, when they needed to tax the rich, democracies did a better job at it. And that has some potentially interesting implications about thinking about interstate competition. In the ancient Near East, the supreme power to levy taxes on everyone is an important marker of sovereignty. For Babylonia, under Nebuchadnezzar, for example, this meant a restoration of royal power after centuries of political fragmentation. In this prism inscription, shown here, he imitates a type of text that would have been instantly recognizable to his contemporaries from its shape as a symbol of the once mighty Assyrian Empire, which previously dominated the Near East and regarded its conquered subjects as Assyrians, who were equal under the awesome power of the god Ashur. Babylonia, by contrast, was a patchwork of rich and proud cities that had successfully resisted centralized power until the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. This text and others seem to articulate a concept of fiscal fairness. No one is above the king. No one escapes royal taxation. The king was, after all, advertising this claim, which blatantly violated entrenched privileges of particular cities whose disunity had ensured centuries of violence and periodic domination by Aramaic and Chaldean tribal warlords or by Assyrian kings. So the conscription of labor is what's at issue here in this text. Nebuchadnezzar asserts control over all lands, and he orders his people to build his palace. We know that labor dues were levied on all types of land holdings, and perhaps even on urban areas and populations. Those who could afford it and wished to avoid corvée labor service typically paid in silver money. Even professional soldiers who were given land as compensation for military service had to pay taxes in silver for mandatory labor dues. Likewise, large institutional landowners, such as temples, were expected to mobilize their manpower on behalf of the king. It was not unknown in the ancient Near East for the wealthy to be called upon for extraordinary contributions. In Jerusalem in 609-608 BC, the Egyptian king Necho II deposed King Josiah and installed a new king over Judea, who was expected to pay him tribute. The king made a levy in silver and gold based on an assessment of wealth. Imperial tribute paid by the rich was not deemed to be especially fair and often ended in revolt. A few years later, in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city of Jerusalem and took many of its people into exile in Babylonia. Similarly, after the Persian Empire conquered Babylonia itself in 539 BC, wealthy citizens of the major cities were sometimes called upon to bring tribute to the king's palace in Susa. How such taxes were assessed is not clear, but obviously identifying who had the ability to pay was crucial for levying large sums of money. But if they were not perceived as fair and legitimate taxes, the wealthy were also best poised to resist them. The Babylonian temple elites responded to Persian demands on their wealth with a great revolt in the early 5th century BC. Taxing the rich was generally not a sustainable imperial strategy. It was far better to co-opt provincial elites in the exploitation of the poor and the weak. In Egypt, just as in Babylonia and Judea, public finance was patrimonial in the sense that most land and other revenue was locked into temple and royal domains. For example, the god Amun in Thebes was one of the largest landowners in Egypt. The rich earned their income by owning hereditary priesthoods that entitled them to a share of revenue from their domains, from the temple domains. Priests received plots of land on which they had some property rights and paid relatively low fixed rates of tax. The rest of the domain was directly supervised by temple officials or leased to middlemen tenants, while the dependent cultivators who tilled the soil had to bring all or most of the harvest to temple granaries for sifting and apportioning and kept only a small share for themselves. The tax burden effectively fell on the poor. Analogous was the administration of the royal domain, which expanded after Egypt was reunified under Necho II's Sayite dynasty. This papyrus contains the treasurer's orders to provide estates within the royal domain to some professional soldiers. They would be charged a fixed rate of tax. Those who belonged to the privileged strata of military and temple officials did normally pay lower taxes compared to the tenants, so royal tenants would have had a different arrangement. Fiscal fairness in Egypt at this time meant respecting these status distinctions, leaving the king to draw revenue from his own domain and ensuring that temple revenues remained intact. The king could use his religious authority to sell vacant priesthoods, but taxing the temples or the priest's income was politically dangerous, almost off limits, as we'll see later in my talk. On the contrary, the kings were expected to donate royal land to the temples. A much easier target for Egyptian kings or kings in Babylonia was to tax trade by restricting foreign merchants to a few key ports, such as Naucratis, where the Greeks were required to do business. The bottleneck allowed the king to levy relatively high, say 10% customs duties in silver money on the value of their cargoes. That is far higher than the 2% customs duty that was typical of Greek port cities in the Aegean. Now let's move on to Greece, where I want to talk about Rhodes and Athens first. As we learned yesterday from Walter Scheidel's talk, for most of human history, it's generally only in times of mass mobilization warfare and other catastrophes that the rich have consented to pay higher taxes that might alleviate economic inequality on the grounds of fiscal fairness. Arguments about whether and under what circumstances it is fair to tax the rich for redistribution to the poor existed already in ancient Greece. As Shive and Stasavage refer to in their book, for example, the anonymous author known as the Old Oligarch, writing in Athens in the late 5th century, describes the Athenian constitution and notes that it was fair for the common people to have political power and to benefit economically from the state because they were the ones who served as rowers in the Athenian navy. In fact, we find an even more explicit link between taxing the rich and the performance of personal service, above all naval service, on the island of Rhodes. Rhodes was one of the major naval powers in the Greek world, but its constitution vacillated between democracy and oligarchy. Writing in the reign of the Emperor Augustus, Strabo claimed, "The Rhodians are concerned for the people in general, although their rule is not democratic. The people are supplied with provisions, and the needy are supported by the well-to-do by a certain ancestral custom. And there are certain liturgies that supply provisions, so that at the same time the poor man receives his sustenance, and the city does not run short of useful men, and in particular for the manning of the fleets. This is consistent with Shive and Stasavich's conclusion that the persuasiveness of compensatory arguments, rather than democracy per se, was perhaps the main factor driving taxation of the rich. On the other hand, despite what Strabo says, Rhodes was at least formally democratic for most of its history, even though the rich there wielded considerable influence. Greek city-states depended on two major contributions from the rich, which are best known from 5th and 4th century Athens. First, just as in Rhodes, there were liturgies or compulsory public services, like I mentioned. The most expensive in Athens was the so-called triarchy, which required a wealthy person to finance the maintenance of a warship together with its crew for 1 year. Second, the wealthy were required to pay extraordinary taxes in times of war, which are what I intend to discuss for the remainder of my presentation. Athens levied these extraordinary taxes on income during the 5th and 4th century BC. As you can see on this slide, the Athenians were traditionally classified into 4 census groups according to their income, measured in medimnoi, or bushels of grain, oil, or wine. They had an incentive to declare these income categories because they conferred social status, and some offices were restricted to those in the highest classes. But when the Athenians needed revenue, they had a convenient registry of who was most able to pay taxes. One later author, Julius Pollux, ascribes to each of Solon's, as they're called, the Solonian census categories, he ascribes to each of the classes a sum of money. A plausible modern interpretation or reconstruction here says that this was a template for levying the tax on income. For every 2 talents of silver levied, show you this reconstruction here, the highest wealth class, the 500 bushelmen, would pay 1 talent, so half of whatever the Athenian assembly demanded as an extraordinary tax. The knights would pay 3,000 drachmas, the yokemen 1,000, while the 4th class, which constituted a large majority of the citizens, paid no tax whatsoever in the time when this system was in place, which we can't be exactly sure, but perhaps the 5th century and early 4th. We know that non-citizen resident aliens also contributed to these tax levies. And within these income brackets, the tax would have presumably been divided equally, but the census categories themselves make it remarkably progressive. Now, what lends plausibility to this explanation of Pollux? And I should say that 2 talents of silver is a small amount for a tax levy, but you could scale this up to hundreds of talents in times of emergency, and this would give you a template for dividing it. What supports this reconstruction is that the Athenian philosopher Plato, we've heard about, he organizes the ideal city in the Laws according to 4 census classes, just like in Athens. And he claims that the tax levy, or aisphora, could either be based on income or based on a property valuation. And it turns out that during Plato's lifetime, when the Athenians decided to reform their aisphora, or property or tax, and turn it into a property tax, in 377 BC, they joined Thebes in a new war against Sparta. The historian Polybius tells us the Athenians decided to meet the war expenses by a tax levy, aisphora, and made a valuation for this purpose of the whole of Attica, including the houses and other property. So now wealthy citizens had to make property declarations and were called upon, whenever the assembly needed it, to pay a percentage of the value of their property. Levying extraordinary taxes in Athens became more frequent in the 4th century BC as the city no longer received tribute and was exposed to prolonged fiscal and military pressures. Now, it was possible to determine with greater precision the value of property and assess the taxes accordingly. As one of the new liturgies, or compulsory public services in the 4th century BC, the 300 richest citizens were assigned to taxable groups and had to prepay the taxes and then recover the amounts due from their peers. I'm sure we'll hear more about this from Dorothea Rhoda. But Athens was not the only Greek city-state. to institute these reforms and may not even have been the first or may not even have been the model for others. This slide shows the attestations that I've found so far of property tax levies, or aisphori, ranging from the early 4th century BC to the 1st century BC. From the late 4th century BC onwards, there was a great convergence within the Greek world by which virtually all city-states became democratic and virtually all share a common institutional repertoire. These extraordinary tax levies, or aisphori, as well as the liturgy of prepayment, or pro-aisphora, were common elements. Yet there is some variation among these democracies, and it is also instructive to compare how these institutions were implemented by the few oligarchies that remain and in monarchies on the periphery of the Greek world. While it may be true that democracy in itself was not sufficient to guarantee high taxes on the rich, democracies were, I argue, better equipped to face fiscal military crises when they did occur. Contemporaries were well aware of this democratic advantage. To cite Plato again. Plato tells us that it is difficult to get the common people to fight for an oligarchy. This is one of the major weaknesses of oligarchic regimes. And he says if oligarchs want to go into battle, they'll prove to be the real oligarchs when they are outnumbered by their enemies. He says the other thing that they're unable to do, besides unable to get the common people to fight for them in war, they're unable to levy tax levies, aisphori, effectively. And he says they're unable because they're hoarders of wealth. Similarly, Aristotle, writing in the late 4th century BC, attributes the same fiscal weakness to oligarchical Sparta. He criticizes them for being unable to mobilize elite wealth through tax levies in the event of great wars. As most of the land is owned by them, they do not scrutinize each other's contributions. Aside from not holding one another to account, oligarchies, where offices rotated among the elite, were reluctant to put too much money into the hands of their political rivals who happened to be holding office. This is the argument of a recent book by James Tan, who suggests that Rome's senatorial elite in the Republic deliberately limited the state's fiscal capacity by seeking to privatize revenue as much as possible. Only in emergencies during war did Rome seek to levy a tax on property owners known as the tributum. However, the tax was generally seen as an advance payment, which the state would reimburse from the spoils of conquest if possible. A similar practice of reimbursing the rich for their property taxes is tested in the Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily, and I suspect that pure polity competition probably contributed to some of the institutional convergence that we see in the Western Mediterranean. Yet Roman imperialism increasingly made such property taxes unnecessary and undesirable to the oligarchs. In 167 BC, when Rome annexed Macedonia, its foreign tribute was enough for property taxes to be suspended indefinitely. Interstate war also contributed to the convergence of fiscal institutions in the Eastern Mediterranean beyond the Greek city-states during the 4th century BC. When pressed by the same fiscal military pressures, even oligarchical and monarchical regimes tried to tax the rich, but were less successful in doing so. By 334 BC, when Alexander the Great set out on his campaign against Persia, Macedon had some mechanism for levying property taxes. Alexander honored the families of the first soldiers to die on his Persian campaign by giving them exemptions from taxes, including services of their person and tax levies on their property. Alexander was virtually bankrupt when he inherited his kingdom after his father, Philip's assassination in 336 BC. It's quite possible that he and his father had used such property taxes in the past, but after Alexander's victories, they would no longer be needed. Macedon's fiscal institutions had evolved from reliance on royal domains and indirect taxes and monopolies or revenues from mines or timber, to having to adapt to the military competition with Greek city-states such as Athens. Many of the Greek city-states, including those with which Macedon was directly in competition and conflict with, were already using these Athenian-style property taxes on the rich. For example, in the cities of Potidaea and Mende. Now, let me talk about this example from Potidaea. So at the time of Philip II's rise to power in Macedon, there was an Athenian military colony in Potidaea which waged war against the city of Olynthus and its ally Macedon in the early 350s. We have an account of their preparations in a treatise on fiscal administration ascribed to Aristotle, but written at the end of the 4th century BC. And this is what the author tells us. The Athenian colonists at Potidaea, being in need of funds for the war, agreed that all should make a return of their property for assessment of tax. Those without any property were assessed on the value of their person, soma, at the rate of 2 minas. The rich, in other words, were to pay a percentage of their property's value for the war. Those without property had to pay a capitation tax that was conceived as a fixed percentage of the value of their person. In most democratic city-states, including Athens, poorer citizens were expected at least to perform military service, but were not necessarily subject to levies on property. So as I said, the Athenian citizens were not, but they were expected to perform labor or military service. However, we find a similar distinction in a few Hellenistic inscriptions, and we found a similar distinction in the case of Macedonia that I mentioned before, between levies on property of the rich and levies on one's person, which could be effectively taxes in the form of labor service, but they could also be monetized into a poll tax. The case of Egypt offers an especially close and contemporary parallel, which I would like to consider next. So let's move back to Egypt, having considered Greece. In the 360s BC, Egypt was locked in a long and bitter war of independence against the Persian Empire. Nectanebo usurped the throne in a military coup and centralized authority by high-handed controversial measures, which his son Taos continued after he died. They relied heavily on Greek mercenaries, including a certain Cobb Rios, who was an experienced Athenian general and politician. The same 4th century BC manual on fiscal administration that gave us our Potidaea example reports this about Cobb Rios in Egypt. When Taos, king of Egypt, needed funds for an expedition he was making, Cobb Rios of Athens advised him. And from the value of each house, he ordered everyone to contribute, having assessed what is due, and likewise from the value of the person. The passage goes on to describe a series of fiscal reforms attributed to Cobb Rios, which were directed above all at the wealthy priesthood and their temple domains. Another Greek author, Polyaenos, gives a similar description of Cobb Rios's levies in Egypt, adding that the wealthy priests were forced to make an advance payment in gold and silver and to recover the amount later from taxation, which reminds us of the Athenian method of prepayment or proaisphora for levying property taxes. An Egyptian priestly text known as the Demotic Chronicle provides independent evidence for priestly resistance to these very tax levies. The priest who wrote it was critical of the usurpation of power by Nectanebo's dynasty and the illegitimate means that he used to raise revenue from the temples. Persia crushed the revolt in 342 and ruled until Alexander's conquest about 10 years later, and it was after that time that this text was written. I don't have time to go into it in detail here. It's a set of oracular utterances printed here in capital letters, and then a commentary on those oracular utterances. And the time in which the narration takes place is the reign of Nectanebo itself, predicting the coming Persian reconquest. And Nectanebo is described here as the one who gave away the property of Egypt and the temples in order to obtain silver. And his son, Taos, who is discussed in the passage that I mentioned with Cobb Rios, is described as the one who goes by the equal measure of his father. He's described as continuing his policy, and this is all described as a work of greed. The measures taken by Cobb Rios, however, anticipate more systematic reforms of the Macedonian dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander. Since my time is almost up, I will restrict myself to just two examples of the use of Greek institutions for taxing the rich in Egypt. During a period of economic turbulence, Ptolemy IV, Philopator, shown here, introduced an extraordinary tax on the value of houses, just as Cobb Rios had done. This papyrus is one of many declaration forms that survive from many different parts of Egypt through archaeological excavations, and were all dated to a single year, 209 BC, which proves that it was an extraordinary one-off experiment, a levy or aisphora, like we saw in the Greek world. The payer here declares the house and courtyard belonging to him. He declares its property value, and he says he submits this so that he may pay the taxes due on them. Within just a few years of this innovative experiment, Hellenistic Egypt would witness the most severe revolt in its history. There were other impositions on the temple domains that may have contributed to this revolt. What we can gather, I think, is that many wealthy priests and owners of expensive homes considered it quite unfair for them to bear the burden of the king's expenses, who had a reputation for ostentatious living in Alexandria. Ptolemy IV's successor, the boy king Ptolemy V Epiphanes, tried to reconcile the Egyptian priesthood while at the same time brutally suppressing the revolt. He called a vast convention of representatives from all of the temples of Egypt, as some of his predecessors had done likewise, something like a kind of proto-parliament, where they issued an honorific decree, this one known as the Rosetta Stone today, the Memphis Decree, thanking Ptolemy for various concessions, including remission of taxes, levied undoubtedly as emergency measures in the preceding conflicts. One group was particularly difficult to tax, namely the citizens of Alexandria. The capital of the kingdom was constituted as a Greek polis, and its urban population frequently had a hand in overthrowing Ptolemaic kings and queens. In 41 BC, Cleopatra VII issued this decree, together with her son Caesarion, exempting from the tax levies established according to circumstances and moments of crisis the Alexandrian citizens. The alternative to taxing the temples or the Alexandrians was for the kings and queens to squeeze their domains even harder. Cleopatra and her predecessors tried to levy extraordinary taxes, or aisphori, modeled on those in the Greek polis, on the Greek and Macedonian military settlers who lived in Egypt. And we can see from the surviving accounts that many of these soldier landowners in Egypt simply refused to pay them. The tax compliance was demonstrably low. In the process, the soldiers themselves, however, developed a stronger corporate identity. They collectively petitioned and negotiated with the king about the fairness of their assessment. So what can we learn by way of conclusion from this tour of the ancient Mediterranean and its fiscal practices? I started by saying that equal treatment is not a sufficient argument for taxing the rich. Equal treatment could be, like Nebuchadnezzar's universal claim to labor service, at least in part an expression of legitimate kingship. Equal treatment was a reassertion of state sovereignty, which required, in this case, the violation of certain elite privileges. But it was not in itself an argument for taxing the rich, certainly not at a rate higher than everyone else. We saw that attempts by tributary empires to tax the rich, particularly with the argument that they were the ones who had the money to pay, did not have much purchase. Wealthy subjects revolted from taxation that they perceived as illegitimate, especially when kings sought to extend taxes into the domain of the temples. Democratic Greek city-states, by contrast, were remarkably successful at taxing the rich when necessary, but democracy per se did not lead automatically to taxes on the rich. Even opponents of democracy, such as Plato and Aristotle, recognized that its fiscal capacity was superior to oligarchies like those of Sparta and Rome. When peripheral kingdoms such as Macedon and Egypt came into intense contact and competition with Greek city-states, they too tried to emulate fiscal institutions. Paying property taxes gave the taxpayers considerable political leverage. Macedonian kings were willing to bow their demands and make concessions as long as they needed funds, but it was difficult for them to credibly commit to act according to the interests of these representative bodies. The question we're left to ponder is whether, in the absence of the Roman imperial conquest, centuries of interstate competition would have forced kingdoms such as Macedon and Egypt to develop constitutional solutions that could compensate the wealthy for paying higher taxes, as in European history. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Yeah.